A new report is urging Montreal, one of Canada's biggest and most diverse cities, to do more to deal with systemic racism. Montreal's own public consultation office says the city government can start by acknowledging that systemic racism exists in the first place. Our coverage begins with Laura McQuillan and the details coming from this new report. Laura.
This is a deep look at the way that the City of Montreal and its police force interact with racialised and Indigenous Montrealers, John, and as you say, it's found a lot of work to be done. In this report, it covers off things from the way that staff are hired, the way that housing is inspected, right through to education and cultural funding, and it has a number of key findings. All of this resulting from a 20,000 signature petition that triggered hearings which have been going on for the past 2 years. A lot of members of the public coming forward with their experiences and wanting to share ways that they believe that the City of Montreal can be made better. Now, among the findings are the fact that the city told this office that's investigating this, it itself doesn't recognise the, quote, systemic nature of racism or discrimination. In fact, it avoids using those words, instead favouring language like managing diversity or living together and intercultural relations. Now, other issues include the fact that it's not collecting the right data to know how big the issues are or how to fix them. And this report also saying that the current anti-racism efforts in Montreal focus more on integration of immigrants than they do on knocking down systemic racism or diversity issues, or discrimination rather. Now, that language around using the words systemic racism and discrimination are key here, and one of the authors of this report spoke to us this morning about why it's important that Montreal can use those words.
It's very obvious that if you cannot name something, if you cannot recognize it publicly, you cannot fight against it effectively. You have to wonder, is there underrepresentation? Is there overrepresentation? If there is, there's probably some bias. We have to find them and we have to correct them.
And another big issue in this report, racial and social profiling by police. That's been an issue in Montreal for years, and the report says that until there is change from the top of the police force, those issues are going to endure. John.
Okay, Laura, that's the problem in stark terms. So with 38 recommendations, what are the solutions according to the report?
Yeah, this really crisscrosses everything that's going on within the city and the police, as I mentioned. If we take a look at some of the key recommendations, they include, first of all, recognising the systemic nature of racism and discrimination, using those words. Now, this report also calls for the appointment of a commissioner to counter racism and discrimination by October of this year, and then within a year, them creating an action plan to fight racism in the city. It also calls for things like mandatory anti-racism training for municipal employees and for police. And on that point about police, it says that new recruits should be screened for any racial prejudice, while hiring the next police chief should involve them proving they understand what racial profiling is and putting forward an action plan to address that. But one key issue behind all of this is that lack of data, a lack of information collected by the city on how bad things are and therefore knowing how to fix them. And when this report was being put together, when the hearings were taking place, just getting access to that data to be the basis of this report was a challenge. Here is what Dominique Olivier had to say on that point.
It took 7 months for the city to just give us some partial numbers of what was going on into the different services in terms of employment, in terms of grants. Some of the numbers we haven't even gotten as 2 years later. So that gives you an idea of how big the work has to be done to make sure that we can measure the phenomenon and then make sure that we can put forward the measures that are necessary.
So right there, just one example of the work that does need to be done. Now, just about a week ago, we heard from Quebec's Premier François Legault, his view that there's no systemic racism in Quebec. This report begs to differ, John, and also calls for action from the provincial and federal governments.
Thanks for this, Laura.